Okay, welcome those who don't know me, because we've got one or two new joiners. I'm Keith Marshall. I'm membership secretary and other things for the society. No longer a trustee. However, I host these calls. Welcome to this, another of our online talks about AP's work. And tonight we're joined by Society Secretary Paul Milliken, who's going to talk to us about Venusberg. Paul is going to talk to us about Venusberg. He's entitled it An Englishman Abroad. Paul is a former HR director of Shell UK, and if I remember rightly, Paul, you were introduced to dance when you discovered it in a bookshop when you were working abroad somewhere in the Far East.
I was posted to Borneo and needed something to read for the 3 years I was in Borneo, so I took
that. Paul is now secretary of the society, having taken over from me a few years ago. So, okay, Paul, over to you. Tell us about Venusberg.
Thanks, Keith. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I actually have no internet at home at the moment, so I'm in my neighbour's dining room. So thank you, Lydia. Hence the cuckoo clock in the background, which is not my normal backdrop. Yes, so to talk about Venusberg, and my focus today is actually going to be on the insights that Venusberg gives us as to how Anthony Powell's life informs this early novel, and how the general reader might spot signs emerging in Venusberg of the sort of what I would call the Powellian style that comes to maturity in dance. Let me start with some personal observations on why I enjoy reading Venusberg. First up, I worked and travelled in Scandinavia about 10 to 15 years ago, so I have some understanding and sympathy for the city landscapes and characteristics of the various nationalities. And I think Powell captures these well through his descriptions in Venusberg of the architecture, behaviour and dress of the inhabitants back in the 1920s. Secondly, I mean, the disturbances in the region in the 1920s that form part of the plot in Venusberg are now very relevant to the tensions between Putin's Russia, NATO, and the relatively newly independent Baltic republics. And I checked today, they're all, of course, members of NATO now: Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Sweden, etc. And as Nick Burns says in his book Understanding Anthony Powell, whereas Venusberg might have been seen once as a rather quaint curiosity, it now has contemporary relevance in a way arguably that no other AP novel has. And third, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that Venusberg is the real beginning of a Powellian style that comes to maturity in dance, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Venusberg was Anthony Powell's second novel following Afternoon Men. It was written quickly and published in 1932, although interestingly in the USA it was not published until 1952, 20 years later, as part of a double volume with Agents and Patients. Second slide, Keith, please. Thank you. So let's look at the main characters and the plot. The plot itself is rather thin, really, but let's focus on the three main ones: Lushington, Da Costa, and Ortrud Mavrin. Lushington is sent to an unnamed Baltic country to cover the political upheavals that have followed independence, this being the 1920s. He is broken up with Lucia's girlfriend in London, who harbours unreciprocated feelings for his old school friend Da Costa. And one reason why Lushington accepts this assignment is that Da Costa is also living in this Baltic country as part of the British Embassy staff. Following arrival, Lushington embarks on an affair with a married woman of Austrian descent, Ortrud Mavrin, who's previously been met on the boat trip, crossing from London via Copenhagen. Ortrud's husband knows that she has a lover, but mistakenly believes this to be Da Costa. Following one of the many official receptions and balls that they all attend, Da Costa and Ortrud are killed in the crossfire of an assassination attempt on the local police chief. Lushington then returns to London and Lucy. Several minor but memorable characters appear, notably Count Shibatchev and Count Bobol, and you can see my description of both there. Next slide, please, Keith. So the background to writing. Why did AP write Venusberg? Well, he was drawing upon the time that his father, Colonel Powell, spent in Helsinki, where he was there in a military liaison role. AP spent 2 Oxford vacations in Helsinki, also visiting Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, which faces Finland just across the Baltic Sea. During these trips, AP accompanied his father to various official events, and both the people encountered, including Russian exiles from the Bolshevik Revolution, only a few years previous, and the atmosphere and architecture of Helsinki and Tallinn, they're vividly brought to life in Venusberg. Hilary Sperling captures this in her biography of Anthony Powell, quote, "Scores of visiting cards pasted into Tony's photograph album testify to a lost world of minor diplomats and dignitaries, army officers, polyglot officials, assorted princelings, counts and barons. The people he met and whose visiting cards he kept for the rest of his life belonged to the wholly unfamiliar society depicted in Russian novels, all of them only just beginning to infiltrate English consciousness for the first time in translation." It's an important thing to remember. So the impact was greater than one might have thought, given that the Russian novels were only recently becoming known certainly in England. In the 1920s, Powell also made a train journey from Trieste to Belgrade, where he encountered an Austrian baroness, and in AP's words, quote, "her rather flirtatious blonde friend," unquote, who partly inspired Lushington's lover Ortrud in the novel. Also met was, quote, "a baron of indeterminate origins travelling in cosmetics, who shaved in beer when the taps ran dry," unquote. He was partly the model for Count Bobol, who was a comic and memorable minor character. AP's personal circumstances are also relevant, and I'll come on to those a little later. I mentioned earlier that one of the charms of Venusberg for me is the emergence of a Powellian style, which comes to later fruition in dance. Next slide, Keith. And these are the aspects that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. So the first part of the style, drawing on places and characters met in real life, which we know from dance, of course. The uses of place and events experienced in real life. AP made clear he was not attempting in Venusberg to replicate the exact political situation in the Baltics, as the novel was written some years after his visits, 5 or 6 years, in fact. However, the buildings and streets and some of the official social occasions faithfully reflect those encountered by Powell in Helsinki and Tallinn. To that extent, there is an element of reportage, although not in the kind of satirical vein employed by, say, Evelyn Waugh. We find the same, of course, in some of the dance novels, and there is a particularly striking sentence that seems to prefigure the opening of dance in a question of upbringing. It occurs late in the novel when Lushington makes his departure back to England by boat. Here is the paragraph, quote, "The boat began to move away from the side and down the watercourse. There were cranes and low warehouses on either side, and lighted flares at intervals, which showed up the red and yellow wood of the buildings. On one of the quays, 3 drunk night watchmen were dancing hand in hand around a fire," unquote. And you'll remember the beginning of A Question of Upbringing, where a very similar event occurs with the workmen around their brazier. And we're indebted to a late friend, Dr. Jonathan Black, for spotting this. He highlighted it in his invaluable paper on Venusberg, which was presented to the Society's conference at Eton College in 2013, and that's worth digging out, particularly for the what Jonathan talked about in terms of what was going on in Finland and Estonia at the time of Anthony Powell's visits. So the second point, love and relationships are central. We need to remember that at the time of writing the novel, Anthony Powell was single. He was in his mid-20s and in relationships with two older women, Varda and Juliet O'Rourke. Hilary Sperling, in her biography of Powell, identifies Juliet as the model for Ortrud, who, like Juliet, is bored with her older husband and has the same tart way of speaking, a rather sparkling hardness, as Lushington describes it. Ortrud seduces Lushington after a first tentative advance on his part with a practiced speed and skill that, in Lushington's words, leaves him surprised and rather shaken. There is no doubt that AP is drawing on his own experience with Juliet when describing Lushington's affair with Ortrud. In his writer's notebook, published after his death, there is an early entry, which one would think applies to Ortrud. Quote, "She's the sort of woman who, if she'd been taken in adultery, would have caught the first stone and thrown it back." Unquote. Might also apply to Pamela Flitton. For me, the passages that describe the beginnings of Lushington and Ortrud's love affair on the boat have some of the erotic charge of the love affair between Nicholas Jenkins and Jean, as it first appears in the acceptance world. Take these examples from Venusberg. Quote, "They leaned there together, looking out towards the sea. I was so surprised when you kissed me," she said. "I did not know that Englishmen did that sort of thing." Now you know. Now I know. They moved to a seat beside the wireless cabin. She seemed to him absurdly slim and yielding beneath her heavy coat. She sat there for a time in his arms. Unquote. They then go to his cabin on the boat, and in AP's words, quote, "She gave herself to him. He was surprised and rather shaken, feeling that he'd been carried unexpectedly off his feet." Unquote. They arrive at the quayside and are waiting for customs.
Oh.
This is the last quote of that section. Quote, "Ortrud said, 'It is good that we have reached here before the ice. Often at this time it is frozen up. We've had a lucky voyage.' Only her eyes, blue and lozenge-shaped, appeared above the collar of her Persian lamb coat. Lushington slipped his arm behind one of the suitcases and touched her hand. She caught one of his fingers between two of hers and said, 'We must all meet again when we have recovered from the voyage, Mr. Lushington. You will come and have dinner with me and my husband?' Unquote. I feel the tenderness of the writing here and the secret complicity of the two lovers suggests the similar scenes must have occurred with AP and either or both of Varda and Juliet. And if you want to know more about that, Hilary Sperling's biography gives quite a bit more detail around the linkage between Juliet and Ortrud. Third point, an interest in the occult, which we know from Dante with Mrs. Eardley, etc. In Venusberg, this is lightly touched on by means of a fortune-telling session with playing cards on the boat conducted by the Baroness. She starts with Lushington and rather ominously starts by saying, 'Like all your countrymen, you are prey to melancholy, the spleen of Hamlet.' She goes on to a detailed prediction which accurately describes the ebbs and flows of his future affair with Ortrud. She then produces the Ace of Spades as the first card for the impoverished Russian count, who believes it to foretell the death of his grandmother, whereas in fact it is the count who dies later in the novel. And the fact that Powell treats the whole sequence seriously is noteworthy. A gift for describing set-piece parties, the fourth point. For example, the triennial ball in the Hall of the Knights in Venusberg. Quote, "At one end of the room, the band from the Café Weber was playing Strauss, and at the other, the president sat, a small man, wearing two short evening trousers. He had been given a high Spanish chair so that his feet were just off the ground, but he sat there looking happy and interested in everything that was taking place. A group of cavalrymen stood behind him, leaning romantically on their sabres, mopping and mowing at their friends in other parts of the hall, and assisting the room's chiaroscuro with a solid background of red breeches. Unquote. I think if this passage was read to many of us blind, we would have guessed AP as the writer. It has his ability to paint the picture with its various colourful eccentricities without at all being satirical at the character's expense. And last point, an interest in and sympathy for the military and their dress and habits. Colonel Powell's role, of course, meant that AP during his vacations in Finland would have had plenty of opportunity to observe soldiers of all ranks and nationality. This is how he describes Valdemar, a young captain in the Finnish or Estonian army. I paraphrase. He had a fur cap on his head, was clean shaven and wore pince nez. His double-breasted military overcoat had a high waist and broad sheepskin collar. Underneath his overcoat, he wore a khaki tunic, well cut but very tight, and a pair of blood-red riding breeches with a yellow stripe down each leg. And this description reminds me of the sketch of a 19th century continental soldier that AP drew in the Eton magazine as a teenager. And also conjures up an image that could have been one of the cutout pictures in the boiler room collage at the Chantry. AP's observations on the behaviour and habits of the various nationalities are often very funny. At one of the parties, Lushington observes, quote, "The American minister, who with the help of the German leading lady was energetically lowering his country's prestige at the far end of the room." At the grand ball in the House of Knights, Lushington spots Ortrud talking to two officers, one Swedish, one German, who, quote, "stood by her in the clockwork, angular attitudes required of Teutonic gallantry," unquote. And one last example, at an informal gathering with attractive ladies present, the talk turns to an earnest discussion about the woman's role in society, and an Argentinian official, Diaz, makes an abrupt exit because he, quote, "saw the party developing along lines that no South American could tolerate," unquote. I think these quotes illustrate an attitude that for me is symptomatic of a certain type of an Englishman abroad at that time. He observes national habits without malice or making judgments. Above all, he tries to retain his manners. A Frenchman or even a Dutchman, nationalities I have worked with overseas, would be likely to react and comment rather differently. James Tucker, in his book The Novels of Anthony Powell, sums up the link of Venusberg to dance in terms of narrative method. The style in both is unemphatic, oblique, deadpan, and he makes the point that Lushington is the closest model for Nicholas Jenkins in the pre-dance novels, an ironic observer and listener. For Tucker as well, Ortrud is a far more beguiling and credible character than Susan Nunney in Afternoon Men. And indeed, her sheer physical presence, as well as other qualities, makes her, for Tucker, the most successfully realised female character in all of Powell's novels. Now to the title of the novel, Venusberg. Next slide, please, Keith. The frontispiece of Venusberg contains this quote from Baedeker, which was the ubiquitous guide used by British travellers to Europe at that time and earlier. Here, according to popular tradition, is situated the Grotto of Venus, into which she enticed the knight Tannhäuser. Fine view from the top. Apologies for the lack of an umlaut over the second day of Tannhäuser. My keyboard can't cope with that. This grotto is found as part of the so-called Venus Mountain or Venusberg, which is situated in Saxony in eastern Germany. We know that AP travelled through Germany with John Heygate in 1929, so perhaps he and Heygate visited the site. There has long been a folk tale in Germany of a mortal visiting the so-called otherworld, where he is enchanted by the fairies and other spirits. This tale developed into the legend of the knight Tannhäuser, spending a year at the Venusberg worshipping Venus. Wagner, of course, based his opera Tannhäuser on the legend, and this brought Venusberg to popular attention. Perhaps Anthony Powell saw a production in Helsinki at Tannhäuser during one of his visits, we don't know. What we do know is that AP chose his titles with care. So let's examine the parallels between the folktale, the opera, and the novel. Next slide, please, Keith. So Tannhäuser, these are the similarities to the opera. It was originally entitled Der Venusberg, in fact, by Wagner. I've mentioned it's a German folk tale, and there's clear parallels between Tannhäuser, Lushington, the novel, and Venus, Ortrud Mavrin. In the folk tale, Elizabeth, who's daughter of the chief knight, loves Tannhäuser but is loved by another. And we have parallels in the novel. Lucy loves Da Costa, who doesn't really care for her, but she doesn't really care for Lushington, who loves her. The singing contest in Tannhäuser is held in the Knights' Hall, and we have the Hall of the Knights in Venusberg. Nicholas Burns makes the point that Wagner is an unlikely inspiration, and in fact, if you look at the music that Powell chose, the Desert Island Discs, there's no sign of Wagner there, and the kind of slightly ponderous heaviness of the Wagnerian method doesn't really fit with AP. But in Venusberg, AP has Lushington saying, "It is a new country. I think Russia had some of it before, and Germany." Also worth noting that John Heath Stubbs, Alistair Crowley, and Swinburne all wrote about Tannhäuser and Venus, and no doubt AP knew those works as well. Next slide, please, Keith. So, no, go back one slide. Sorry, Keith, go back. Just before we leave Tannhäuser. I think the parallels are significant, though, even though there maybe isn't a Wagnerian link particularly. We know that AP was interested in legend and myth. His personal situation, he was enchanted by two women more experienced than him in the arts of love, but essentially unsuitable or unavailable as a wife, Vada Juliet O'Rourke. So the plot of Venusberg, with Lushington escaping a doomed love affair in what seemed like an otherworld, neatly mirrors this stage in AP's life. So how was the novel received, and what have recent AP scholars made of it? Yeah, next slide, please, Keith. Thank you. So at the time, L.P. Hartley, a friend of the Powells, of course, rated it quite highly. He said it was as good as Afternoon Men, perhaps better, full of fire and wit. And he goes on to say it's escaped the fate of many second novels after a first promising novel. Graham Greene, who was never a particular fan, worked both ways, rather caustic, mildly amusing in the evil and war manner, caricature and understated humour without war's narrative power. And some of that I think one would agree with. Elizabeth Bowen perhaps neatly wraps it up rather well, a wry Baltic idyll. So the idyll, the Venusberg folktale, the other world of Venusberg. More recently, Michael Barber says he thinks it's the nearest to a 30s novel that AP wrote. Difficult to see exactly what he meant by a 30s novel, except that one of the minor characters, Count Boble, he says could have clearly come out of a Graham Greene novel. He smokes amber cigarettes, slightly sinister. Hair smells of coconut oil. Could have been on the Stamboul train. Nicholas Burns, as I've said, rates it actually quite highly. He sees it as once seen as a quaint curiosity, but sees it now as very relevant. And Jonathan Black, who I've mentioned before, makes the point that he believes it left Anthony Powell with an enduring interest in Russian culture, which made a big impact on AP at the time, and a suspicion of Soviet communism. And so let me conclude by expanding on Dr. Black's comment. Just go to the last slide then, Keith, please. So let me expand on that. I've mentioned before that in Jonathan Black's paper called A Far Cry from Camberley, presented at the Society's 2013 conference, it's worth a reread because of the recent developments in the Baltics, Russia and Ukraine. Jonathan researched in depth the parallels between the situations in Finland and Estonia in the 1920s and those described in Venusberg. For example, there was an abortive communist coup in Estonia in the mid-1920s during Colonel Powell's assignment. The Estonians looked to Britain for protection from a rumoured invasion by the Soviets. As early as 1919, the Royal Navy had prevented Tallinn from falling into the hands of the advancing Red Army. Jonathan also discovered those who formed the basis for the key local characters, such as General Kuno and Captain Valdemar. So Jonathan contends that AP's Baltic visits with these incidents as a backdrop formed the basis for his later antipathy towards and distrust of communism, an antipathy that Jonathan points out was distinctly unfashionable at the time. It's worth recalling the words of Henri Frédéric Emile, a Swiss 19th century philosopher, which Powell quoted in a Cornhill magazine article when warning of what the Russians would do to countries in their power. Quote, "They would bring about polar despotism, tyranny such as the world has never known, silent as darkness, rigid as ice, insensible as bronze, decked with an outer amiability and glittering with cold brilliance of snow, slavery without compensation or relief." Unquote. Similarly, when I worked in Scandinavia about 15 years ago, I asked a Finnish friend of mine about the Russians. He quoted a Finnish saying, which goes, "A German will come at you openly from the front with a gun. A Russian will express his pleasure at seeing you, envelop you in a bear hug, and then stab you from behind." But let's get back to Venusberg and the Baltics in the 1920s, as described by AP, who was an Englishman abroad, as he describes it in Infants of the Spring. Quote, "Most Finns detested the Russians, Tsarist or Soviet, but their social life, to a considerable extent Scandinavian, had inevitably been influenced too by Russian domination. One entered a social world familiar in Russian novels, of which there was no precise English equivalent. Diplomatic, official, professorial, everyone knowing everyone else, no one at all rich, everybody inhabiting flats. My Finnish visits brought vividly alive the societies described on the one hand by Strindberg and Ibsen, and on the other by Dostoevsky and Chekhov. For that reason alone, I've always been grateful for them. They were a useful lesson in learning that one's country's own ways of doing things are not necessarily everyone else's. And, being deplorably bad at languages, I became something of a master of broken English, an asset when serving as liaison officer with the Allies 16 years later. And that, ladies and gentlemen, gives us another link to the inspiration behind both Venusberg and A Dance to the Music of Time. Thank you. Okay, Keith,
Okay,
moderate questions.
I'll take the screen share away. Okay, questions for Paul, possibly points of discussion. Cheryl's had her hand up for some time, so Cheryl, over to you first.
Thank you, and thank you, Paul, for a really illuminating talk and opening this book up for us in a very clever way. You mentioned in the course of your remarks someone that you said, I think was May Ortrand, the most successful woman character in the AP world. Is that correct? Did I understand that? And when
that's the view. That's the view of James Tucker, who
I see.
wrote in the novels of Anthony Powell, which is actually a very useful guide to the novels, I find. And I think Tucker's take on Venusberg, I couldn't find much to disagree with. If I remember back to my days when I was Anthony Powell's age, I can remember some of the feelings that a woman like Ortrud Mavrin might have engendered in me in some of the situations. So I think she is very well realised, better than, say, Pamela Flitton is obviously a very memorable character in Dance, yes. But Ortrud Mavrin, I think, is more rounded as an individual.
And remember too that Tucker was writing a lot of his stuff before AP had even finished Dance. So
yes, correct.
And in fact, anybody who hasn't picked up on it, Tucker died about 6 months ago, year ago, fairly recently anyway, in his 90s.
Thank you.
Okay. John Blackster. You're on mute, John.
Right, so thanks very much, Paul. That was absolutely superb, mainly because it encapsulated so much of what I'd been thinking about, having reread it in anticipation of your talk. And it seemed to be quite a different novel from when I read it quite a few years ago, because of those very things, the relevance today, and also the fact that so many little things are in there, which I now recognize as being the Powellian style, and wonderful things like even a bit about military trousers fastening under the foot, which comes, I mean, how many times can you use that? And the set pieces were brilliant. I mean, and with the little touches like Boble leaving an ashtray like a bonfire, just little things which every now and then I kept on, well, breaking out in laughter. The two characters that I'm quite interested in, and maybe other people have got opinions about, but the American, Courtney, wasn't it? Yes, Courtney, yes. Who seems a very sort of blank canvas, and Mr. Pope, who yes. I wonder whether there are echoes there of Bracy and also of say was it Blackhead, wasn't it? And the yes. But I just wondered if you hadn't touched on those two characters, so they're still open for any discussion.
Yes, I think the American makes some rather droll observations about the English. So there's a whole AP takes the opportunity to sort of have characters of different nationalities give an opinion about the English, which is always very amusing. And I couldn't quote all of them, but I think he's quite successfully realised. I'm not so sure about Pope. Those who know the novel, those who don't know the novel, he's Da Costa's servant, who's a local, and is in a relationship with the receptionist at the hotel. And I was never particularly convinced by Pope. I mean, he's a useful sort of linking device in the novel, but he didn't really come that alive to me, although he's very comic. I think the other point, I mean, the impact that these visits made on AP, I think was more significant than I first appreciated, like you, John, when I first read Venusberg. And actually, I read Venusberg before Hilary Sperling's biography came out. And in the biography, Sperling makes the very good point that we've all become rather blasé about international travel, and we see the world through the internet and on TV programs. For a young man like Powell, visiting Europe and the Baltics in the 1920s and being exposed to Russian literature for the first time in translation, I mean, this would have been almost overwhelming. I think it made a huge impression. And as he said in his Infants of the Spring, it really influenced him for the rest of his life. And I think some of that does come through in the vividness of the descriptions and the characterizations in Venusberg. So from that point of view, as well as the style and the narrative method, I think it's an important novel in AP's development.
Remember too that the travel would not have been aircraft either. It would have been boats, as Powell obviously sets parts of the novel. No, and it would have been relatively slow. I mean, it would have, I don't know, 5-6 days possibly to Helsinki from somewhere in the UK.
Yes, well, they of course they devoted Copenhagen. I mean, one of the characters in Venusberg says to Lushington when he gets to this Baltic country, "Oh, you will have met the other passengers on the boat and had time to spend time with them. Of course, you will have fallen in love with Ultrud Mavrine, given you were there with her for about 3 or 4 days." And poor old Lushington is a bit put out by that. Indeed, he has fallen in love with Ultrud.
Okay, anybody else? Anybody else? John again.
Well, only if nobody else wants to say anything, but following on from the sort of travel aspect, this is anecdotal, but my father, who was 10 years younger than Powell, went to Finland at the same stage when he was at university with some friends. And the photographs, they took 2 small cars, which were sort of loaded into the hold on a crane and so on. But the pictures show them, I mean, they're miles and miles. There's nothing there at all. I mean, they went to partly for fishing, in search of enormous trout. But it is all tents, and they had enough equipment to make. Remember Abthorpe from Evelyn Waugh? They had sort of stacks of everything. They had to take everything with them. Sort of stoves, beds, tents, etc., etc. Because with nothing else, once you're outside Helsinki, that was it.
Yeah,
there still isn't much there.
No.
From what I can gather, I've got a friend in Helsinki at the moment, and what little I'm seeing from her, there still isn't a lot there outside of outside Helsinki and a handful of other largish towns. Alf.
Hello. Yes, just on the question of travel, in one of the, I don't know whether it's penultimate chapter or near that, it says that Lushington is chatting with somebody, and somebody says, I'll find out in a minute, what is it, Lushington, that makes you want to travel by sea when you could do the journey in half the time and 3 times the comfort by land? So presumably that's by rail.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
interesting. Yeah.
And he
Yes.
answers, I thought the sea journey might make a story for my paper, which is the kind of thing he would say.
Well, you could certainly do Sweden overland by train these days very easily.
Well,
I know of people who've done that. I don't know how easy. Obviously, I don't think Finland would be so easy. But if you can get to Sweden, you can probably get to Norway.
Well, of course, remember AP couldn't drive at that point. I think he learned to drive a little later, so he was reliant on his friends for driving through Europe.
Oh, right.
I would have thought by sea is the obvious way. I mean, you can get across Denmark to cut a bit of the time if you don't want to go through the, what's it called, the straits there. But anyway, it's just a. I'm trying to work out who he was talking to, but it may be Courtney, I think. Yeah, might be. Yes, it's
Courtney the American. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've got two asides really, Paul. One is, do we have? I mean, has DJ Taylor ever written anything about Venusberg? Because his opinion might be quite interesting.
I didn't find anything, but it's possible that he might have done. I know. Oh, Bernard Stacey, I think, is on the call. Somebody mentioned to me that Bernard might have written something on Venusberg. Is that right, Bernard?
Come in, Bernard.
Yeah, I remember a long time ago doing a piece for the newsletter about I think conversations between Count Sherbachev and Bobel on board, but it was very much a tongue-in-cheek pastiche. It wasn't remotely as academic as what we've been hearing for the last hour.
Okay.
Yeah, I can try and dig it out. It must be 10 years ago now.
Yeah, I mean the passages on the boat are sort of hilarious, really, with Count Bobel, who, as there are 2 ladies on board, Bobel, who's a real womanizer, managed to insert himself at the table and easily rebuffed the attempts of the stewardess to eject him. You can just see it, can't you? Because he took the seat normally occupied by the Russian count because the 2 women.
I think from memory, I sort of invented a bit of a backstory for them both.
Yeah.
I'll have to dig out the article.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael.
I just wanted to ask, this is a completely a tangent. Does anyone here, including Paul, you of course, have any comments on the name Lushington as a name? I don't much like the connotations, and we know that Paul picked his names carefully. Any comments on Lushington as a name?
Well, before anybody else jumps in, I would say that the use in the US of lush as somebody who's over fond of drink is not one that's common in the UK, in my view. And I'm not sure whether it would have been common at that time. But
I think it was much more common than it is now, Paul.
Right. Okay. Fine. Okay.
Certainly back in the sort of 50s and so.
But
possibly before.
But there's no indication in the novel that Lushington is fond of drink, over fond of drink. So no, I don't know where that comes from. I didn't look for it in the writer's notebook, but I'll go and have another look when I get back.
But Lushington itself Lush is actually an abbreviation of Lushington. A Lushington is a drunk.
Oh, it works that way round, does it?
Does
I
it?
think so.
Okay. Okay.
I stand to be corrected, but
Well, maybe there's a link there with the fact that
Well, I don't think there is a link. No, I mean, why? Yes.
When you think of the folk tale of Venusberg, I mean, this young man is entering into another world and actually is enchanted, and in a sense loses his senses in a little, to some degree, you know. And he comes to his senses when he leaves and goes back to the real world. So maybe there's a link there.
Actually, I've just looked up Lushington as a place, and apparently there is no place, unlike, say, Widmerpool.
Yeah. Okay.
But there was a place. It's a lost village in Kent.
Oh.
I don't know. So a lost, and it's old English name, and there was a village. But I mean, I just wonder if that is the sort of obscure fact that AP would have loved and maybe have noted, the idea of a lost village.
And the lost world. Yeah. Thanks, John. Yes, that's helpful.
Interesting. Thank you. With Kentish ancestors, I shall have to go and look it up.
Jan?
Dig it up. Dig it up.
Alfred's still got his hand up. Are you, Alf, you wanted to come back in? You're on mute.
It just occurred to me that does Venusberg appear in the book other than as the title of the book? Because actually, is it referred to in the text?
No, not that I can recall.
So obviously there is that reference to the Tannhäuser stuff. Then that must be implied. Then.
Yeah. I think Jan Reed wanted to come in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Paul. And apologies, Keith, I can't find the little hand on my iPad. Thank you very much, Paul. I just learned so much. I enjoyed the book a whole lot. It really picked up speed. And I wonder if I could display the cover of the American edition, because it's very much the Baroness's world.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Is that coming through?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. And that's very, very similar. Who did? Is that an Osbert Lancaster one?
Is that an Osbert Lancaster cover?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yes, it's a Lancaster.
Yeah, because this is the one in the paperback in the UK.
Yeah.
Very similar, the other way around.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is the ball in the Hall of the Knights.
Yeah.
You can see all the military people there.
Yes.
Talking of Lancaster, you mentioned the three drunk night watchmen dancing hand in hand. There's a wonderful Lancaster cartoon somewhere of three Greek sailors dancing in a line, sort of doing line dancing, which is worth a look. I think it's quite amusing. Jill, come in, Jill.
Yes, thank you. Just going back to Lushington. Thank you, Paul, for that. It was interesting. When you were talking, I kept thinking, because my area of work is to do with intelligence history, and in the 20s, this is what the Baltics is the entrepot of secret intelligence, the interface between British and indeed American attempts, because they couldn't get into Russia easily. And on the name, I kept thinking of Ashendon.
Yes.
Purely because it has the same kind of sound to it, that's all. And Ashendon, some said, well, that was published in 1927. And I mean, there may be no connection at all, but it has the same kind of feel about it.
Yes.
A kind of slightly shadowy world in the Baltics, and around at this early sort of post First World War period. Sorry, that may have no connection at all.
Well, no, I think it's interesting because it raises the point about, did AP or his father have any connection with the secret services? Now we know Muggeridge was an agent.
I mean, if he was a military attaché, it kind of slightly goes with the turf.
Yes, I think although Colonel Pole's temperament might have debarred him from.
Yes, I can't see him, from what I've read about him, I can't see him as a successful intelligence officer, but any military or naval attaché at that time in those regions is going to come across, for example, Bolshevik attempts at espionage, which is rife. Again, a contemporary relevance now.
Yeah, and I mean, reading the accounts, particularly by Jonathan Black, of what was going on at the time, you know, makes quite sobering reading, really. And I mean, there are parts in the novel where one of the characters says about General Kuno, when Lushington, I think, asks, you know, why does he have to be kept under guard all the time? The lady said, oh well, he's killed lots of people, and he killed hundreds of people the other day, and some of them were supposed to be Bolsheviks, and it turned out they weren't Bolsheviks, but that's the way it goes here, you know. And there's a bridge that people are thrown off, and you know, it's quite a bit, not Wild West, Wild East, I should say, really, at the time.
And of course, he survives.
Yes.
Yes. Jeff Manley.
Yes, thanks again, Paul, for this talk, because it's getting back to the point of Venusberg. I always thought that was the name of the city he visited, although I don't think he ever repeats it.
No, he doesn't.
And when you read the book, sometimes you're reading a description of Helsinki, and sometimes it's Tallinn, because he always talks about the high town and the low town. Well, that's Tallinn.
Yeah.
And the Russian Orthodox Church with the blue dome, that's probably Helsinki. It could be Tallinn, because they both have a very prominent Russian Orthodox church. But then he goes off skiing, which I don't think you can do in Estonia. I don't think there's
in Finland,
a hill anywhere that you could use for skiing. So he just sort of shuffled them together, for his own purposes, and gave them, I think, the name Venusberg.
Yeah, although he's careful throughout. I mean, even slightly unbelievably, Lushington is described as, when he's setting off, never being able to remember the name of the Baltic country that he's going to, which seems rather clumsy on AP's part. Yeah, I mean, you'd think that if Venusberg was supposed to be where he was staying, it would be mentioned, but it isn't.
Okay, anybody else?
I think so. I'd just like to say thank you very much, everybody, for joining the talk.
Yeah.
I see a couple of people leaving that have got Russian-like names, so I hope they haven't been offended by what I said and quoted from Anthony Powell.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We'll hopefully meet again soon. Thank you, Paul.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye.